So thank you for having me here tonight. And I've been invited to talk about, as mentioned, trade and tensions. And I thought that one good way to look at the problem sometimes when things are difficult is to go back to basics of our system and history and lessons from history. And one of the theme of the evening for our exchanges is the role of international organizations, for which we owe a lot to the Swiss. 40 some of them are in Geneva. And international organizations are really engine for collaboration and cooperation between states on specific issues, health, or telecommunication, or postal. But tonight I'll talk about the trade organization, the WTO. And it's especially also interesting to do this here in Chicago, a place where trade is also and was historically important. You all know that in 1848 they discovered or created this sort of passage from Mississippi to Chicago River, the telegraph, the Board of Trade, and 100 years after, another event also linked to trade was the creation of the GATT. And it's interesting to remember, because we know that the Americans these days have issues, at least with some trade matters, that it's the Americans who push for the creation of this international trade organization, and it's themselves who linked the health of trade with security. When during the Second World War, towards the end, the Americans wanted to create this organization, they had developed a slogan, which is more true than ever today. And the slogan was, if goods don't cross frontiers, soldiers will. Trade is important for growth, for development, and this helps, of course, peace, and trade favors transparency. So the GATT was created, and as I mentioned, the goal of this system was to help and favor and contribute to economic growth, to employment, to development. The logic of the GATT was to force government or encourage them to negotiate tariffs, that is, money collected around their frontiers when they import goods. And the idea was that each government would exchange and commit to respect a maximum level of tariff and make this public. Today, with the tensions on aluminum, on steel, we're still talking about tariff that the Americans have raised. So this old problem is much relevant. GATT, and still WTO today, is also about non-discrimination. It's the old Anglo-Saxon club. We are a club. The Commonwealth and the old colonies of before the war are over. And what benefit and privilege we give to some members of the club must, in principle, be given to others. It's not a family, but it's clearly a link between some governments. That's at the heart of the GATT and the WTO today. Of course, there are exceptions. For instance, governments may restrict trade for health reasons, for environmental reasons, and for security reasons for that matter. In 1948, the GATT started, and long life to the GATT. Throughout the years, the trade grew importantly. Tariff went down from quite high levels to, on average, 4% for rich countries on industrial goods, because countries agreed not only to meet in Geneva in the GATT to talk about specific problems, but also to reduce these import tariffs at their borders through mutual exchange. I give you this, you give me that. Throughout the period of the GATT, there are all sorts of interesting statistics, but to make just one simple, global trade increased by 27-fold between 1948 and 1995 when the WTO started, and in the United States brought at least, according to the US own website, $9,000 per year per family of benefits. So I think there's no doubt that trade can lead to prosperity and important benefit. Now, where does the WTO fit? Governments were happy with the GATT. They trusted the GATT, so they decided to expand the GATT. And thanks to a proposal indeed from Canada, together with the EU and Mexico, it was decided to create a real international organization with the WTO, because the GATT was not really a full organization. There was a proposal to have one, the International Trade Organization, in '48, but the US signed and did not ratify. GATT was a chapter, if you want, of the ITO, just dealing with these tariffs. And as I said, it's an old issue, still true today. So the governments agreed finally to the creation of the WTO, which covers what the GATT covered, plus new things, more responsibility. That is, it covers now also intellectual property. They took all the existing treaties that were governed by WIPO, the World Intellectual Property, and brought them under the umbrella of the WTO. They also added services, because trade and services is important. Banks, insurance, electronics, etc. And they invented a new, fantastic dispute settlement system. The most powerful dispute settlement system that exists. It's still amazing today to see what governments were able to agree on, including our friend, the United States. It's a binding, compulsory dispute system that is automatic. States cannot refuse to be sued. They must follow, and if they don't comply with the judgment, there are trade sanctions. So this is evidence of the trust that all governments had in the system and in each other. What happened since? Well, first, one element that is dear to me, the Quad, that was an informal subgroup, disappeared. The Quad was the United States, EU, EC-EU, Canada, and Japan. Canada became fairly quiet, although they had been active throughout the Uruguay round that created the WTO. China acceded in 2001, a very difficult process. It took 15 years. And as you know, when a government accedes to the WTO, they promise to respect the rules of the treaty, but much more, because it's a club. So the members of the club can require that the acceding country does more. So China, for instance, was asked to reduce its tariff on average. China's tariff today are at 10%. Just to give an example, India, it's 70. Because if it's true that during the GATT, the main players reduce their tariff, the developing countries were not so much involved, and not much was requested and required from them. But China, a lot was required from China. Developing countries grew in importance, and this is possibly one of the difficulties. They grew, and I'm not only talking about China, there's South Africa, there's India, and remember that when the GATT was created in '48, there was no developing countries, or almost none. You had the colonies, but you didn't have the decolonization before late 50s, 60s, and with the 60s and 70s, developing countries started asking for more and more, in particular less subsidies in agriculture, more fair trade in textile. So all this was part of the evolving changes. Today, what went wrong? Why is it that the United States and others complain instead of being so sort of believing in the WTO, which the United States and others created? If I may, I would say the change of geopolitics is the main reason, more than the rules themselves, because it is still true today that trade favors growth and therefore enhances society exchanges and reduced chances of war, let alone the impact on transparency. But the new players are there, and some new, very new players, such as Arabic countries or Ukraine and Russia, come with a new approach. Everybody talks about security. Never this was done before. Russia and Ukraine and others are suing each other, and the security exception has become a bit possibly too easy. Second enormous problem, economies of all or many new players are organized differently domestically, and that's the problem of the so-called state-owned enterprise or state trading enterprise in China, Kazakhstan, Russia, and other places. The GATT rules and the WTO rules are rules for governments. For instance, on subsidies, the rules say you should not give export subsidies, you government. But in China, it's a bit more complicated because it's not the governments that gives the subsidy, it's sometimes the state-owned enterprise. So the existing rules do not match maybe sufficiently or properly the reality of the new players. There are also problems of intellectual property because it goes to the conception of culture, whether or not it's important to copy. In our cultures, it is. For other governments, things are different. There are also problems, in particular in the United States, with the so-called anti-dumping and anti-subsidies. These are duties that governments can collect when goods arrive cheap or subsidized. And there's ways to calculate these duties. And this is the area where the United States lost a lot of disputes. Because whatever they say, the Americans have been winning 80% of the disputes they've been involved. They are great winners. They initiated this dispute settlement system, and I remember they were the one pushing for it, while the Europeans, on the contrary, favored more diplomacy, and they had to be convinced. They initiated a lot of dispute, the US. They won a lot of those disputes in many areas, except in these very concentrated areas of trade remedies. Now, President Trump arrives. The United States feel that it's unfair. That, for instance, if they give subsidies, the rule would control what they do, and they believe that the rules are not fair with China and others. So they come, and they have raised their duties on aluminum and steel above the maximum they had promised, which for these goods was between 0 and 4%, a lot of very, very, very low tariff in the United States. They raise them and they invoke security. In addition, they raise them, of course, against China and the rest of the world on steel and aluminum. But in addition, they start raising 25% on a long list of goods coming from China, and another 10%, which could even go up to 25 on 1st March. Why? Because they claim that the system has become unfair because the existing rules, which they created with others, do not correspond to today's problem. And I don't think that it's necessarily wrong that the rules need to evolve. But in WTO, all decisions are taken by consensus. This was part of the deal. Consensus is not unanimity. The consensus is that those in the room decide, and if nobody objects, it goes through. But if one objects, even if it's a small country, things do not go forward. I've seen many, many times situation where you have one country, India is known to be a strong objector, or a small group of countries blocking. And this is a reality that is difficult to deal with. You could vote, but then it's risky, because I'm not sure the interests of the United States and others would be sort of accepted or would be responded positively if you had a majority vote. You could have a weighted vote, like in IMF and World Bank. The WTO has always maintained, and the US still maintains, that the consensus is the best way for dealing with problems. But with 165 countries, it's difficult. So just to take one small example, e-commerce, the email, all the world of electronic, the United States and many countries, including China, 74 of them, stood together and said we should sit down and deal with this problem. And you have South Africa, some African countries, and India who say no. So how to deal with the problem? This is an area where the WTO now is trying to reflect of new ways of developing rules, possibly regional groupings. So you do have, as mentioned by the head of the Quebec office, you have the possibility of NAFTA or EU or Mercosur. We should maybe think of new concept, not regional physically, but subgroup to push ahead those problems. What is happening, in my last point, at the moment, and that's the trade war, is that because the United States, for leverage reason, I believe, has decided to raise its tariff and has also started blocking the appeal court of this famous dispute settlement system, which they wanted so much. They refuse to vote, or rather they block the replacement and the nomination of new judges. This has led to, of course, an enormous tension with an amount of disputes never experienced before. 9 countries, including mine, are suing the United States. And because the United States raised its duties on different goods, a lot of countries did the same. And now the United States is suing all these countries, 7 of them. And of course, and that's positive, and that's another reason why the WTO is to stay and should stay. For the first time, you have new alliances on issues such as intellectual property. You have US, Japan, and EU suing China on intellectual property, suing China on different issues, and of course, China responds back. So at the moment, you have roughly close to 20 new disputes in the recent month. A lot of work for people like me, because in the WTO, the role of the legal service is different from other organizations. Our main role is to help the judges when there are disputes, because the judges are nominated like arbitrators for one specific dispute, and they're not paid, or almost not paid. They continue their job. Many are ambassadors. They're very, very busy. But the GATT and the WTO Secretariat now lends them staff to help do research and draft. When I started my job 20 years ago, we were 4 lawyers helping those arbitrators. Today, there's 80 of them. It gives you a good idea of the size of the problem, but the size, if the United States says we should sort of destroy the WTO, it's an awful organization, they even threaten to leave, it has never been so used. And the discourse of the United States has also changed. Because if they do have issues with dispute settlement, at least in some areas of anti-dumping and anti-subsidy, their discourse is now, and that's what USTR Lighthizer said, if the WTO did not exist, we would have to create it, because they need a forum where they can talk. Of course they can talk to China bilaterally, but they have realized, and their discourse has changed, that they have friends in the system that can help them deal with these new issues. And most governments would agree now that the rules need to change. The rules need to adapt. Things change quickly, and suddenly everybody's waking up and would agree that it's true that there's a need for adaptation. So I would have one last comment about the trade remedies, and before I end, about trade dispute and the war. You have, I'm sure, understood that if one country decides to raise its tariff contrary to its commitment, others will do the same. And then back those increase of duties backed by those who are frustrated, but it's even more complex. When, for instance, US raised its tariff, China reacted. Agriculture producers, farmers in this region, for instance, are not able anymore to export their agriculture product to China because they're too expensive. US used to be the world's first soya bean producer, at least the biggest soya producers for China. It's not anymore because it's too expensive, because China reacted in increasing the duties. Brazil has become. So Brazil is happy. There's something a bit perverse about that because some countries benefit. EU has also discovered that there are areas they could export. But EU has other problems because in raising duties on products, countries that used to export to US or to China now wants to export to EU. And EU wants to protect itself, may end up punishing other countries. That's a trade war. It's one action triggers a second one, and then it gets worse and worse. Where to discuss that other than in a multilateral forum? I'm not saying that dispute is a solution and it's for judges to decide, but in my view, it confirms that altogether, the Americans were pretty right when 70 years ago they said, if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. So whatever we say, however you call it, whether it's GATT or WTO, there's more than ever a need for international collaboration and discussions, and this can take place in different areas, of course, but Geneva is the place of international organization. It has all the logistic, and the WTO remains a forum where these issues can best be discussed. I'd like to thank for tonight all those who made this possible. I'm not going to name everyone, but certainly my government of Canada, Quebec, the Swiss Benevolent Society, and of course, Alliance Française, and my old friend Marie-André, whom I met when I was 17 at the time when we wanted to change the world, and we both have continued to try to do this. Thank you.
Messieurs, Mesdames, je m'appelle John Cruickshank, je suis le Consul général du Canada. Je suis très heureux d'être ici avec nous ce soir et avec notre partenaire, la délégation de Québec et certainement l'Alliance. Gabrielle, that was wonderful. That was so exciting. I have so many questions. Let me start with a big picture question. And just to let you in, we had a conversation this morning that was tremendously stimulating. So I'm going to follow on some of those things, if you don't mind. How do you think that there is a relationship between the rise of populism and the rise of protectionism? Is that one of the streams that are relationships that is hitting the WTO as well as our politics everywhere?
I fully agree with you. And I know that I'm not supposed to ask you questions, but I think there's a clear link between the rise of populism and protectionism and the desire to raise duties. I think the more complicated issue is, why is there a rise of populism? What happened? Where did we miss something? Because protectionism is exactly what we wanted to control when the GATT was created, encouraging discussions and transparency. Where did things go wrong?
And that takes me back to, in that transition from GATT to WTO, I mean, from that period, 94, 95, and you have seen it all. You were there for the transition year. The growth in trade globally has been just enormous. The success that we have had as a race, all of us, the human race, in bringing people out of poverty has been extraordinary. In some ways, it seems certain that WTO has been a tremendous success. Why does everybody feel it's a failure these days?
I think we discussed that this morning.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that we may have forgotten, or that may have been forgotten at least in the United States and other countries, is to spread and share the benefits of growth. There is no doubt in absolute number that countries have become richer. But there are differences. We discussed this morning the north of Europe or Switzerland. These are countries that have policies in place where the benefit of trade and growth is appropriately or quite well distributed among people. If the benefits are not properly distributed, then you do have individuals who feel that it's not fair, and you can't blame them. The problem is that there is no international organization responsible for distribution within a country. This is taxation system. And this is not regulated internationally. We see a bit in the newspaper that Google established a headquarters in Ireland because there's less tax. Yeah, it's a problem. But the distribution, the taxation, and the domestic policies are where maybe not enough attention was paid.
And that is clearly apparent in events we're seeing in France, in the United States, all over the world, frankly.
Yeah, the Gilets jaunes is a bit about that problem.
Yes, yeah, an extraordinary. One would, a year ago, you would not have predicted this was going to break out in Macron's France. Fascinating. Let me take you to China, because I think in some respects, and again, we spoke this morning about this, China didn't develop in the way that everybody thought it would develop after accession. There was a notion that if China got more fully engaged in the world economy, that it would liberalize politically. Didn't happen. But let me ask you a question. China made a lot of promises at accession in 2001. Has it kept those promises?
I have to be very careful, as you know, as a civil servant.
Of course.
And plus...
This is off the record.
I'm not sure it's...
I use that with every interview.
I think China made a lot of promises and kept a lot of promises. And as I said, they, for instance, reduced duties importantly. But maybe, let's say that, in my view, it's probably both sides. A bit of naivety, maybe, from those who negotiated on this side of the table for China to exceed. For instance, I mentioned subsidies or state trading enterprise. State trading enterprise have always existed in China. But the commitment for China is to reduce the number. They did reduce the number, but there's nothing about the size. So there are lots of commitments also in this so-called protocol of accession that are not so clear. And you almost need to look at them from your lenses. And China may look at them from another perspective. And on state trading enterprise, I asked the negotiators myself, why didn't you deal with this problem at the time? You were there, you could have written things. Why didn't you put more details? This is a few lines. And the truth is that everybody, as you rightly said, expected that China was going to change. And not only China, it's not the only, it's a bigger one. But Russia, Kazakhstan, all these countries also come with their own different economic system. And this is where part of the problem is. Transparency. If you say transparency is a principle, it means something for Canadians. You know, we're transparent and nice. It may mean, it may mean something different for other countries. And then the answer, at least from the lawyers, why didn't you develop this more? Just say you will favor transparency. What does it mean if you never had transparency? So from a technical point of view, I think that it's not right to just blame China. Maybe they were pretty wise. Maybe, I don't exactly know, but clearly some things happen, plus a lot of things change. Electronic commerce. I worked on a dispute where Antigua Barbuda, a small country of 60,000 people, sued the United States, saying the United States does not accept internet gambling. The United States, as its Puritan side, said no. It's contrary to many laws in the United States. But this country was able to find a little commitment called others in sport. And if you look in dictionaries, sport includes gambling. And the United States lost this dispute and was told, if you gave a commitment at the time, it meant that you would accept, of course, building of gambling establishing. But today, internet exists, so you must accept internet gambling. A lot of countries were surprised. You can imagine the implications in banking and other areas. So there were changes in electronic commerce, I think, participated to this new growth, but to the new difficulties of having rules about tariff on goods that now need to apply to new realities. And changing the rules at 165 is difficult.
Yes, yes. I was actually very heartened when you said in your talk, and you discussed it with me this morning as well, the fact that the administration now appears to have a slightly more positive view of WTO, because there was some concern in the early days of the Trump administration that they were simply going to walk. Now the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, is now speaking about the importance of WTO. Tell me a little more about that.
Well, it's exactly what you said. Now the United States seems to, they still have an issue with the dispute settlement system. They're still blocking the nomination of the Court of Appeal. And this could have a terrible impact because there are 7 judges at this appeal court, and now 4 were not renewed. There are 4 empty seats. Only 3 are in place. And in December 2019, 2 of them, the American and the Indian judge, will have, their term will expire. So the court will stop functioning with all the problems that come, that if you appeal and there's an appellate court but there's no judge, the judgment is in the air. So they still have an issue there. My own personal academic view is that they maintain this for leverage to change the rules. And yes, I think the US has changed. They put forward a beautiful paper a few weeks ago about developing country. Because in WTO, the rule is that it's for each country to decide whether they're developing or not. And if there's a challenge in court, then the judge could rectify. So any country says, I'm developing, I'm not developing. So China says, I'm a developing country, which drives the United States crazy and scares a lot of other smaller developing countries. The United States put forward this beautiful, very well-researched paper about the fact that you do have now countries that claim to be developing countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, that are richer than European countries. And the absurdity of the system and the flaws, although they agreed with the initial rule. They put forward also with Japan and other countries, Canada is involved in EU, a paper on transparency, explaining what transparency means. Transparency just doesn't mean only you smile to your neighbor. It means you explain, where you put money, what you do. A lot of practices that some countries, I think, do naturally and traditionally that maybe were not done in other places. There are proposals for e-commerce, and that's what I tried to allude to in my talk. Now the United States and others have developed something to balance this consensus. They're called collective sort of declaration. So 74 of them said, we want to talk about e-commerce. And even if India and others don't want to, we will do it anyway. And we'll come possibly with a rule. Now, there's an issue because the backbone of the WTO is whatever benefit you give to one, you must give to all. Therefore, if this group develop benefits, will they have to give it to others? So there's a lot of new thinking that is needed, and that is taking place. How to reconcile, for instance, the MFN principle of the club and accepting subgroups.
Right.
It already exists through regional trade agreements, but should we think of new ways to allow a two-speed process where subgroup could have a bit more rule for them that they don't give to others, maybe at some conditions? I mean, this is not clear, but at least the United States, contrary to a year ago, is playing the game. They also initiate disputes, so they're angry at the dispute settlement system, but they initiate disputes.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. One of the other ways in which the game seems to be changing, and it's hard to see how the game can continue with these changes, and you spoke about it, the use of the national security exemption, in essence, 232 in the U.S. And as Canadians, we feel certain sensitivity about this because at present, Canadian steel is hit with a 25% tariff because we are a national security threat to America. It's something at times you feel kind of a little proud. Oh, really? But not seriously. It's silly, but it's a danger. I mean, it sets the whole trading system into it's a profound change in the rules of the game, and yet it seems to be more common than ever.
Yes, and you may have seen in the press a lot of tensions between Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman. There's a series of disputes that have started between this country, and again, or some stop trading, and I'm not talking about Israel and that boycott. I'm talking Arab countries between themselves, and they invoke security. At least they announce that they will, Ukraine and Russia. And security has always existed, and there are exceptions, and they're there to be used. Environment exceptions, health exceptions, all sorts of things. But now these countries talk about security as if it was like health or environment, and it's extremely difficult. There was self-restraint until recently. Countries almost never invoked it. It's not the job of a trade organization to necessarily deal into these issues that are more political than technical. And it's a problem, and it's difficult. And I don't know. I mentioned that my job, and others, 80 of us now, is to advise arbitrators. So if you were an arbitrator, for instance, and you ask me, so is it a security issue or not, this tension between the two countries? Well, if they're at war and the United Nations has declared there's a war situation, maybe. But what about economic security? And we all know that security is not just about guns and tanks. We talk about cyber security. But is, for instance, steel protection security? I don't want to say no or yes, but there are terribly complex issues that I'm not sure belong to the World Trade Organization. Where do they belong? I think they belong to states and governments and politics, and not brought, and there are many of them. So this is a completely new reality from new members of the WTO that were not there for 50 years, and it's another complication in the equation.
Right, right. And perhaps a way in some respects of being able to, if you don't feel that you're going to succeed in an attack on subsidy or anti-dumping, then you go with a security card. Yeah. I have some questions from some of our affiliates. From Cincinnati, are there examples of countries having left the WTO?
No. There are examples of countries that were involved during the GATT negotiations, Syria, who left, and some countries, Cisjordanie, that don't exist anymore. But no country ever left the WTO, although there's a provision. It's a notification over 6 months, but it's never been used.
Oh, that's interesting. And how many members are there?
165.
Wow, wow. I have a question, and maybe this is it's the wrong kind of question, but one of the things that really changed, and it changed over a long period, is in the immediate post-war period when these institutions were created, there were tremendous restrictions on the movement of capital.
Yeah.
And capital is now completely liberalized, or almost completely liberalized. How has that changed the equation in your view?
I think it does change, and it's part of the new issues for which there's no rule. There's no control of capital movement in the WTO. There are rules on financial services, and indirectly there are a few principles that you should not restrict payment if it leads to a restriction of trade in goods. But yes, that's another issue that I think doesn't help. The world is more complex, thanks to globalization though, but we don't have any disciplines or, you know, what is good or bad, and I think it's part of the problem. And where do you base those discussions? When initially the US and others wanted to create this international trade organization, it was supposed to be in direct links with IMF and World Bank institutionally, and it was to deal directly with employment and labor issues, because doesn't mean much if you grow economically and you don't give jobs. They had understood that. That was all working together. Now, as I mentioned, this was negotiated and put forward by the US, but the Congress backtracked for all sorts of reasons. So we got stuck with only this tariff chapter that was put in force on a provisional basis. That was the only trade agreement until the WTO, but alone, floating alone with a lot of gaps. And you hear more and more unions and other people, and you raise the question saying it's all very well, these numbers that US is wealthier and Canada and others, but you know, what do you do with jobs? What do you do with other problems and distribution? So we really have, we being the world, to think again the multilateral system because it is at risk because of those gaps, I think, in the rules.
And because of the pressures. I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things we see here every day is this administration grappling with the notion of American companies that actually have most of their capital everywhere else in the world, and that they have supply chains that stretch out all the way around the globe. And it's a complex process for somebody governing in that environment. Wanting to keep jobs in Kankakee, or you know, it's not easy.
And taxation. You know, there is no agreement about taxation. Right. So countries have different tax level, even within the EU. They haven't harmonized this because it's difficult. But more and more governments complain. And I gave the example of Google just as an example because it's in the press. But you know, Google doesn't pay tax in many countries where it gets benefit. Maybe we should completely think and change our approach to taxation that is country-based. With globalization, where frontiers change, maybe we should have maybe the old way and something else.
Yeah, it is very challenging. But of course, even as you say, within countries, the enormous competition, using taxation, using all sorts of other benefits that the states and of course, as you will remember, we don't have free trade in Canada yet amongst the provinces. Yes. We have it with everybody else in the world, just not with ourselves. That will happen. Can I? Yes.
I will just ask you to ask the question in the microphone when you're ready.
Do we have questions? Please.
Monsieur?
With the rise of trade tensions around the world, the NGOs have been very active at the WTO over the years. In the current environment, what role are the NGOs playing currently?
Well, it depends what you mean by NGOs, but in the WTO system, which is a government to government, companies are NGOs. Think tank, universities, so anything that is not a government. But what you do here, and I believe it's true, is that the private NGOs, if you want, the companies, may not be as involved as they should be to explain first the benefit of trade and the risk of having restrictions. And those issues, such as, you know, payment and all that, are complex. And you're right that the WTO has opened its doors to NGOs, and in dispute they can put forward now written submissions. I'm not saying that they don't do enough. Well, I think they don't do enough. I should backtrack and change my position. And academics, I met different people from universities here, and they all came with suggestion of reforms, which is something that didn't exist a few years ago. And I think there's a beginning among the people in general realizing that we really need to think differently. We really need to come up with new approach. Taxation, I come again on this issue. It's a fundamental problem, and it's directly linked to distribution. And I think the ideas have to come not only from governments, but from the so-called civil society, broadly defined to include companies and others. But no specific proposal to all that I've talked about that I'm aware of.
Other questions?
There's three there.
There we go.
Hi, thank you for coming. What are some of the reforms that the WTO is thinking about in terms of like settlements, the issues of IP, the issues of, you know, like you're talking about distribution, you know, what are some of the things that WTO think should be done to, you know, change some of the rise in popular, the popularism and things like that? So
Traditionally, the WTO is said to be a member-driven, and this was a big insistence from the United States and others. That means the WTO itself never puts a proposal forward. All proposals only come from states, from governments. Sometimes they get the idea from NGOs, but it's even prohibited for the WTO to put a point on the agenda of a meeting. It has a very powerful dispute settlement system. The staff are experts. They're entitled to whisper. So to whisper to a state, but things do not come on the agenda unless it's sponsored by a government. And it was mentioned, I used to be the advisor of Pascal Lamy, who was the EU trade minister and the DG of the WTO, and he had the Commission background. And in Europe, the Commission has the power of initiative, it's called, the power to put forward a proposal that could be rejected. And he was always outraged by the fact that you have this big group of experts, how come we cannot propose things? And I kept telling him, and he was not happy, well, we can give ideas, but you need to whisper them to this ambassador and that ambassador. And of course, this ambassador brings the proposal to its capital, and they may not like it. So some, and again, it's an EU proposal of 2 months ago, I think. EU, in its proposal, has said we need to give more power to the Secretariat and the freedom to put forward some proposals. And if we don't like them, maybe we can push them out. But some governments don't like that, because once a proposal is there, it will be there until it's kicked out. Is it by everyone or just one? So there's no WTO proposal on any of that. Even me coming here, I do it. I had to be authorized and all this. So there's an effort of outreach to tell people, please help us. Please come with proposal. But there's none as such from the WTO as such. Yes, but you have to, yes.
Any proposals that you'd like Gabrielle to take back? We're looking for ideas. Okay, let me turn for a moment then to the Alliance Française in Milwaukee. How have the countries who have more recently joined changed the organization?
Well, it depends what you mean by recently, but China has certainly
Course,
changed,
2001.
but that's 2001.
Yeah.
But Russia, Ukraine has changed. Kazakhstan changed a few years ago and is becoming sort of more and more active. And the next ministerial meeting, where ministers, trade ministers meet every 2 years, will take place in Kazakhstan in June 2020. So it has changed. I think this is probably one of the biggest change. Not only the number of players, but the fact that developing countries that are not so much developing countries are now part of the equation and the deal, and they want to help, but it's still different voice. It's not easy to find consensus between 165 countries. And I'm not sure that a vote via majority will make it easier. What is needed is this chemistry also between countries, this desire to want to collaborate. And I was telling you this morning that when I did my PhD, I read a book that has influenced me a lot by Richard Gardner called Sterling Dollar Diplomacy, that explains that at the beginning, US, UK, all talked together to create the GATT, and things were going well. And then there was a change of staff in the US delegation. It was not even an issue of Republican and Democrat. It was different people, and the chemistry didn't work anymore. And this I've heard often from negotiators during the 80s. Those who created the WTO, they were all individually wanted this to succeed. They were all willing to push their own capitals. And there was this ideology, efforts, philosophy to try to make it work. So I'm not someone who believes that we can only have sort of objective reasons why things are difficult. Clearly, e-commerce, movement of capitals. But there are other things, and I know you also believe in that, that are not sort of mathematic, that makes the chemistry at the moment complicated. And that's why an advice I heard not long ago, all countries should be patient. It's important not to overreact against or with the US or in favor or whatever, because we really need to be careful and study the situation and think. And that's why you were half kidding. But if you do have proposals, suggestions, and you can send them to me, send them to the Alliance Française, send them to your government. We really need to start thinking of new ways for dealing with these new problems and improving the rules. And the governments are working on it, maybe not fast enough, but there are proposals that have started to emerge, and the EU has put quite a few forward that are broader than just specific issues on e-commerce and subsidies. So let's hope that. Do you need the microphone? Because I could hear you well.
Oh, it's okay. I can talk without it. Thank you. You are talking about changing the rules because apparently, you know, the WTO is an old organization, and with the era of the internet and capital flowing all over, how it works at the WTO? I mean, how can you change a rule? Is it a majority of the nations? Is it a qualified majority? Can you explain a little bit?
Yes. On the paper, there are very detailed voting rules. Very detailed voting rules. If you want to change this, you need a first proposal, 3/4, and it goes to another body, etc. The first year of the WTO, a decision was taken by all states, all members, that any change requires a decision by consensus. And you go to voting only if there's a consensus that consensus won't work. So basically, and what is consensus? It's not unanimity, but consensus gives any country the right to block a movement forward. And I don't want you to think that I believe the WTO is outdated. I do think that some changes are needed, but you know, issues of tariff 70 years ago are still true today. The issue between the issues of tariff on aluminum, etc., are exactly what they were 70 years ago, but they are additional issues that are not regulated. And one problem is consensus. So of course, the rich countries will say, we could give up consensus if you give us weighted voting. I'm stronger and bigger, I want more vote. But to change that, you need the agreement of all the LDCs who says, I'm small, but I'm also important. And the number one rule of the WTO, and that's why developing countries love the WTO, is that all states are equal. You don't have that anywhere. There is no organization that works with both all states are equal and consensus. In the UN, it's voting. In other organizations, you have weighted vote. Should we change this? Yes, possibly. But to change it, you need consensus. So that's why I mentioned one idea that has started floating is that the GATT and the WTO has always allowed subgroup of countries to give preferential treatment. The NAFTA, the EU, Mercosur. So these are regional trade agreements. Should we start thinking about subgroup agreements where, or two-speed countries process? Yes, it's a big family, but some are closer. So one is sort of extended family, couple. Maybe we have to sort of think differently about this non-discrimination and this fundamental principle of most favored nation, which was the rule at the basis of the GATT. What you give to one, you must give to others. So we could have that possibly for one set of benefit, and then maybe for new issues, a different approach. So this is coming out from sort of whisper in corridors. Maybe we should change this, because otherwise it's not going to be possible. And not all countries in all good faith are able to cope with all the new needs. So the idea of the WTO, contrary to the GATT, was to avoid fragmentation. And it is one treaty. If you sign the WTO, you're bound by everything. For those international lawyers here, there's no reservation. A government cannot say, I don't accept this or that, which is generally allowed. The idea, it's a big family, we're all equal, we're all bound by the same things, and if we want to change one peanut, we all be on board. This was a beautiful dream. Maybe this should be reconsidered somehow.
Okay, yeah, my mic is kind of screaming too.
It's okay. So you spoke earlier about the rise of protectionism and the attempt of initially GATT and then WTO to curb protectionism in an international sense. But as you liberate economies, as you liberate free trade, and you encourage those countries that were previously underdeveloped to develop by increasing participation in the international market, as those developing countries start to creep into economic niches that other countries, thriving countries, used to occupy, why would you not expect to see an increase in protectionism as those countries begin to develop, in particular maybe the automotive industry with the United States and other countries starting to develop in that particular industry and then become almost competition to the United States, increasing the desire for the United States to apply protectionist policies?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Like any country naturally wants to protect its own production, of course. And people believe that the first job of their government is to help them and help their production. What has changed is that there's no national production that much anymore. So yes, developing countries get into a new sector like automotive, but in the WTO, I think 2 years ago, to increase sensitivity of the people to the multilateral nature of trade, we had an open house. And we had a little room where we explained that most genes involve inputs from 30 countries. And people were surprised, genes. If you think of this and that, the job, the design from one place, the textile from here, the button, all sorts of things. So the problem of protectionism, which has always existed, the GATT was there to limit it and to remind countries, if you're protectionist on this thing, there's a risk that there's going to be protectionism by another country on what you do. To my student in Geneva, I always use the example of Switzerland and how wisely they've managed with the fact that they have a small and weak agriculture, small farmers that they want to protect, so they're willing to put high tariff on importation of some agriculture products. But they also produce watches. They know that. So if they're too terrible on protecting the agriculture, another country beside will say, well, if you don't let me export agriculture, I'm not going to accept your watches. I'll be protectionist. And that's the philosophy of the whole system. Be transparent. Show where you protect. You can. All governments have the right to protect. Tariff are completely legal. You can raise tariff through any time, through compensation, and protect an industry. There's no problem. But if you protect too much your own industry, well, what you export will also be hit by the same. So that's inherently about collaboration. Yes, I let you protect a bit this if you let me protect a bit that, but don't abuse. I don't think that the arrival of developing countries changed this rule. It's more competition, I agree. And it's normal that you don't want competition. But it's also it's more consumers. You know, China is a big consumer. That's why everybody wants to go there or export to them. So if you tell them, okay, we kick China out, a lot will say, whoa, a lot of consumers that go. So it's not simple.
Gabrielle, an opportunity to give a kind of final view as we draw this to a close. And that is trade still a contributor to peace?
I strongly believe that trade is necessary for growth, and growth and development helps avoid peace. But the problem is...
Avoid war.
Sorry. Avoid war. But the problem is, and maybe we were weak, is to explain that, the benefit of trade, and also, and more importantly, the need to distribute the benefits of trade. And it's not, you know, I tell my students, if you raise tariff, what do you do with the money that you make? Do you build school, hospital, or jewelries for the wife of the president? They all giggle, and it's too simple, my example. But there's a bit of truth there.
A bit of truth. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I want to thank you, but I would like to give the microphone to Marie-Simone Pavlovich to close the event before we go have a drink.
Okay. Thank you. I'm from the Swiss Benevolent Society and from Geneva also. So I would like to thank warmly our guest tonight, Madame Marceau, for all the enlightening comments that she gave us on things that we should know and that we don't know, but I'm happy that we will be able to pursue the conversation next door. And I would like to thank also some personalities that are here, like the Consul General of Canada, Monsieur Cruickshank, merci. and other official representatives, the Honorary Consul of Switzerland, Monsieur Oberschmidt, the Honorary Consul of Belgium, Monsieur Van Alteren. And I would like to give special thanks also to my Canadian colleagues, Colin Duke, Keith Iverson, Martin Dion, and Aimé Laberge. And I would like to invite you all to pursue the conversation, because I'm sure that there are still a lot of ideas that have not been solved in your minds. And I'm sure that we would all be happy to share all that with a glass of wine or water or whatever. So thank you for coming.
Yes.